Hello and welcome to this week's episode of RightCast. I am your host. They call me the Jackrabbit. With me as always is the founder of RightChan and a personal friend of mine,
Chatus.
We have with us two guest speakers today, and they may or may not be coming back. We hope they will. They have a lot of information to share, and the first person will be...
Coffee pot.
We decided this show wasn't redneck enough. and our secondary contributor, who is...
Cobra.
Fucking pogues.
Fucking pogues.
Just to be inclusive, we also added a homosexual.
Well, I'm leaving.
Oh my goodness. All right, guys. Welcome to this week's podcast. We are so happy that you've come back to listen to us, and it's going to be a great show, I think. So, Chatus, what is our topic for today?
Our topic today is really whether or not civic nationalism is really a viable system, given its kind of its leans toward multiculturalism.
Okay. So for those of us who are unfamiliar with the term, or maybe someone in our audience may not know exactly what you mean by that, go ahead and give us a rundown of civic nationalism versus whatever else there is.
All right. So fundamentally, you have two basic kinds of nationalism.
Okay, and this is within the right-wing sphere.
Yeah. Okay. The left wing is inherently anti-nationalist, or
right.
Unnationalistic, whatever you want to call it. So in the right wing, you've got two prevailing views of nationalism. You've got ethno-nationalism, which is that kind of old blood and soil. Cultures and people are fundamentally rooted and connected to the land they come from.
Okay.
And then you have
civic... And this is also the idea that people of a certain ethnic nationality tend to do better with themselves. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
The idea that the bluebirds fly with the bluebirds and the
right.
redbirds
fly with the redbirds.
The
right.
redbirds get thrown out of helicopters.
All right. All right, go ahead.
All right, and civic nationalism is basically what we've got here in the United States, where we take, we got a little bit of everything here in the States. We've got people of African descent, Asian descent, lots of Europeans, and we throw them all together into one big pot and go, okay, well, you're all Americans, and that's supposed to mean something.
Okay. Well, playing devil's advocate here, it does mean something. There's something. So we have a proud tradition of being... Traditionally, when I speak to... because I have traveled around a little bit, and I've talked to Europeans, and I've actually asked this question, and I asked them what you see when you look at Americans. And obviously, you get the answers. Overwhelmingly, we always end up getting the answers like, well, they're very bold. They're very, they're very out there, very type A personality. They're very forge your own path, very excitable. Very, these are the kind of adjectives that are used. You get the bold, adventurous, exciting, loud, asshole, on the negative side, the asshole that, that's the kind of idea of what the rest of the world, particularly Europeans, I think, see the U.S. as. Yeah. When you speak to people in Middle Eastern countries, such as Dubai and more developed Middle Eastern countries, they see us as very... Well, they also see us as very loud. They also see us as a little bit larger than life, because we are, as a people, as an American population, we're much bigger, physically larger than a lot of people in like the Middle East and stuff. So it's very... interesting.
It's interesting that you should bring that up. How Middle Easterners see us, because it's funny. We're actually seen in a very similar light in East Asia. Mm-hmm. When I was doing my language training, my entire instruction team was all mainland Chinese, and they have the Chinese have a very similar view to us that a lot of Middle Easterners do. Where these huge, loud, just arrogance engines.
Yeah. Right. So, okay, so you want a discussion on which one is better?
Not necessarily which one is better, but whether or not civic nationalism is a path we should pursue, okay, or whether or not there's like a middle ground to be found. And if not, what path we should take instead.
Okay. So I'll start off with the argument that civic nationalism seems to have worked for the most part. When you look back in our history, you have, World War II was a great bringing together for the American people, just from the America side, and World War I for that matter. This was a big, we had a lot of a lot of people come together as a nation. You know, you had a lot of factories that turned into munitions factories and stuff like that, where we all came together as a people, and we ended up fighting the war, and you know, we were victorious in that. However much of that was us or not doesn't really matter for propaganda purposes. The point is, the after effect was that we came together as a nation.
But if we look at that along ethnic lines, even our military was segregated after the war. There was a lot of tension among American minorities because we fought the same war you did, and we're still seen as second-class citizens. We even events that have brought us together as a nation have only seemed to further intensify the dividing lines between us and caused even greater tensions.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a fundamental flaw with bringing when you bring people together with conflict, you require conflict to sustain it. It's kind of the same problem we have, like, for instance, with the military-industrial complex. You can only fuel that with more war. It's a good the economic benefits are great, but you need war to keep it up. And when you bring people together with conflict or war, that unification will only last for as long as the war continues.
And sometimes even not that long. With Vietnam, we saw desertion and draft dodging were much higher amongst minorities because they knew ahead of time that they were going to go out into the thick of it with the rest of us, and we're still not going to be seen as...
They would never get their just desserts, I guess.
Yeah.
Run this by you, because this is an interesting... simply talking about African Americans in general, I'd prefer to tend to use just the word Black American. I think the term African Americans are rather absurd. It's like calling me a European American. But anyway, but talking about Black Americans in general, looking back, and this goes back to the Civil War, and compare that to how slavery was ended in the United States. Compare that to how slavery was ended in the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, it was legislated out of practice, whereas in the United States, it was through conflict that it was taken out of practice. Now, as a result of that, and the United Kingdom does not have as much problem with their black communities as much as the United States does, or it doesn't have quite the trying to think of
the racial tension.
Right, the racial tension that we have here in the United States. I think that's largely, and you'll probably hear me say this a lot when I'm talking, I think it largely has to do with what you train someone and what you bring someone up. If you tell someone from little on up that you're oppressed, you're looked down on, you don't have as much chance in the world, they're going to grow up thinking that, and when they get older, they'll never be able to break that chain. Most of them won't, some will. Whereas I've seen that, in my own personal experience, blacks that have, gone out, made something of themselves, they typically don't really care, who's who or who has the white skin tone or what. They don't care one way or another. They get out, they go to work. I don't think it's so much a deal where you need I think you can bring people together, but you have to give them a common identity, or you have to essentially take away the whining, or take away the, you're oppressed. If you tell someone you're oppressed all the time, they're going to come at a mindset of, I'm oppressed, so I need to fight for...
Interesting on that. You actually see that in, the groups. So you see that with a lot of MRAs, the men's rights activists.
Mm-hmm.
You hear them incessantly bitch about men's rights, because men's rights is... And I'm not saying there aren't... The problem we run into with stuff like this is everybody has legitimate issues to bring to the table. Like, everybody that I've talked to that have organizations, whether they be state mandated or not, whereas in the case of MRAs and stuff like that, they're not really seen as a state mandated thing, but they have legitimate issues. The same thing with any racial category, be it Black, Latino, Hispanic, or Asian. Yes, there is a difference. But you run into like, they all have legitimate concerns and complaints to bring to the table. The issue is, and we talked about this last week. We were talking about the organizations that are pushing this. They got to feed people, like PFLAG, which is the LGBTQ group. They whether they want to push these agendas or not, and when I say agendas, I don't mean that in the traditionally negative term. I'm talking about just the things they want done.
Right, the list.
When they win something, they can't just pack up and go home. They have employees. Mm-hmm. Same thing with a lot of these other groups, like a lot of these websites that you run, like A Voice for Men is one of the big ones for the MRAs. They have employees. They have writers that are making money.
Right.
So if the issue gets fixed, a bunch of people are out of jobs, which you're creating this self-perpetuating problem where the problems might be legitimate, but if the legitimate issues get fixed, they're not. The groups aren't going to go away. So the question is, how do you make this? How do you get the legitimate grievances aired and fixed, or fixable at the very least, without having a bunch of people, pushing this narrative, like you were saying, that the press, your press, because anybody in the world, regardless of sexual orientation, skin tone, gender, what have you, has something to bitch about. Oh, yeah. Planet Earth can be a kind of shitty place sometimes.
It's actually interesting. This is actually getting to the root of my personal issues with the idea of civic nationalism. Every individual group.
Hey, fine, rope us back to the topic. Jeez.
It's interesting though, because this actually ties in very well. Every individual group, and when you're talking about topics of nationalism, you're mostly looking at racial, ethnic, and religious groups. They all have their own unique issues, their own unique needs, things that are unique to them, and it's fundamentally unfair to both them and external groups to try and expect groups that don't have those issues to care or cater to those issues.
Yeah, like the problem I'm seeing with civic nationalism, and if I hadn't made this clear before, because we didn't really start out very clear, I'm an ethno-nationalist as well, but I think one of the problems with civic nationalism is, like we've been saying, Asian Americans have issues which are different from Black Americans, which are different from white Americans. How can one government address everyone's issues equally and fairly?
Without imposing the values or concerns of those other groups onto all the others.
Yeah, the legislations that would help fix some of the issues for Black Americans could be detrimental to me. I think the best way to go about it is for everyone to have their own governments, which addresses their issues specifically.
Well, ideally, that's actually what the U.S. was founded as in the beginning. That was the whole point of a confederation of states. The idea being that if you didn't like what was happening in one state, you could move.
Yeah, we were originally, as a country, supposed to be a collection of smaller countries, and our federal government's original purpose was just to really facilitate trade and avoid conflict between those smaller countries.
We were essentially the prototype for the EU, which has now failed.
But what ended up happening is, after the Civil War, the idea of federal supremacy came in.
Well, federal supremacy was established.
That really started with the Whiskey Rebellion.
Yeah, like 10 years after our own revolution.
Yeah, but the Civil War is really when it just became concrete. Really, it was no longer up for any kind of debate, and from there it just ballooned. Mm-hmm. We're getting to the point now where aside from a few minor things like gun laws, the states are all really more or less the same now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we've defeated the entire purpose of being a federalized system. We're now just one big homogenous mass with kind of quirky regional variations.
Mm-hmm.
There's no place for us to go. There's no really room anymore for us to go somewhere that holds to our own values
and still remain in the U.S.
Yeah.
And I don't know really what I consider myself, and that's not really a cop-out. I really don't know. I haven't given myself any kind of a label. I like some of the ideas of the ethno-nationalists, but not all of them. I guess in my perfect world scenario, I would view, I wish there was a way that we could all work together and be, the idea being, I wish there was a way that we could sit down and, let's say you sit down across from an Asian, someone who's Asian, and sit down and say, tell me about yourself. Tell me about people, because I like to learn. I like to learn about places, and I love culture. I love different cultures. I've been all over the world, and I've never met a culture that I didn't enjoy at least a portion of it, or some type
Yeah.
or something about it, and I love to learn about different cultures. So I wish there was a way that I could sit down and say, tell me about your culture, tell me about everything about you, but then not have there be like a weird power struggle where one is implied by either party to be better than the other.
Yeah, and that's
like I wish there was a way I could sit down and say, hey, tell me about your people, and I'm going to tell you about my people, and we're going to talk about it and how awesome it is that we have different peoples and different ideas and cultures, and we both leave the conversation having learned something.
Right. Well, and it's in order for something like that to work, you need a common ideology uniting different people groups. I will admit that, and you need, in case in point, in the early seasons of Christianity, when it was first getting started, one of the things that the people surrounding these Christians were looking at is like, these people are from different backgrounds, from different, from different races, yet they go to worship together. They love each other and all that good stuff. And that, whenever you're dealing with a group or a diverse group.
Oh, my bad.
Fire, get out of here.
I guess I'm just going to pack up my podcast and go.
No, leave the computer. You lost that night.
Anyway, getting back to that, though, is you need a common ideology or a common, and for years in the United States, it was Christianity. There was that idea, when someone was at a church, for a day or something, you'd go to their house, hey, is everything okay? Do you need something? There was that ideology there, and even within, even within your black communities and that sort of thing, yes, there was that, I guess for lack of a better term, inequality going on there. But there was still that common ideology, I think, that largely kind of kept us together.
Okay, what you're talking about is a community.
Yeah.
And community is not necessarily something that has to have a religious background for it.
Right. What I'm saying, though, is an ideology of some sort.
What he was trying to say, I think, was that even though we still had our racial lines here in America, before we started really secularizing, Christianity sort of held us together.
Right, it was kind of a glue of a sort.
But I still kind of take issue with that because we did fight a war over this, even when this country was largely Christian.
Mm-hmm.
I think a solution to Jackrabbit's wishing.
Mm-hmm.
As far as being able to come together as equals, and have a conversation, I think the best way to go about that would be for each of us to have our own homelands.
Okay.
Because, if I try to go and have a cultural dialogue with a black American, and I know this from experience because I grew up in public housing, the only white kid there. Wasn't a fun time. And Chadis has just brought pizza.
Really? Pizza! You really could not wait. Pizza! 40 more minutes.
I was prepping for the break.
Very
I'll
well.
just edit this out.
Yes, folks, we are porking infidels.
But, so if I try to have a cultural exchange with a black American, they're not going to be receptive towards that. In general, based on my experience, big disclaimer, anecdote, they're not going to be receptive to the conversation because there is still this, it's a white country and you're a minority here sort of dichotomy power relationship.
Mm-hmm.
However, if we have clearly defined borders where, this is where the former black Americans live over here in, what did the new Black Panther Party want to call it?
New Africa. It's like the entire Deep South.
Yeah. So, if you're a citizen of New Africa and I'm a citizen of Vinland, we can come together and have this conversation because you're not a foreigner in my land, I'm not a foreigner in your land. We're each citizens of equal respective standing in our own lands, and we don't have conflict between each other. Because at the end of the day, we both know that even if we don't like what the other has to say, we can just go home.
Yeah, it's kind of a, when I go home, I don't have to deal with other people's issues because, well, they're not my issues anymore.
Yeah, I think the main failing of civic nationalism is that, if we have that cultural dialogue and a black American doesn't like what I have to say within the context of that dialogue, he still has to live with what I say because I'm still the majority in this country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that causes tension and conflict.
Yeah, giving each group its own nation essentially removes the oppression narrative. If you don't live in my country, I can't be oppressing you because I don't have the legal power to do so.
Well, maybe, but I think what you would see if you started doing that was you'd start seeing trade routes, and I think it would get messy in a different way because I think you'd have, you don't want to do what we think you ought to do. Well, we're just not going to buy raw products from you, or we're not going to trade with you, or blah, blah,
essentially, it'd be small nation states.
Yeah,
so
what you're describing is a confederation.
Yeah,
yeah, but I mean, with trade tension, there's always within a country, whether or not there's a free market is, up to that country. But internationally, there's always the free market.
Well, how do you... so, question there. So, how do you make... If that is what you would like to see, how would you go about doing that? I mean, you talking about like a Trail of Tears to force people out of where they live to go to this other place? Or are you talking about just creating it and letting people go? Because there's going to be a lot of people that simply won't leave because I was born here and my grandfather was here, and frankly, they shouldn't be forced to leave. This is their home.
Well, I mean, if they consent to being a minority in an ethno-state, like...
Right, but they probably won't consent. There will probably always still be that oppression narrative there.
Yeah, if they've been given the option to go to a place where they are not oppressed, and choose instead to stay in a country that isn't dealing with their issues, they had the chance to have their issues dealt with by a country that represents them.
Yeah, and
if they choose to stay under a government that does not represent them, that's a bridge that would have to be crossed when we got there.
The problem I think I see here is it sounds fantastic in theory, but I don't think it's going to be as clean as in practice.
Oh,
as it would be in
statecraft
theory.
is never clean.
Right.
Well, and realistically, the civic nationalist system we have now isn't that clean.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at we're back to the 70s and 80s where we're having full blown race riots again.
Well, I think a lot of that too is being stirred up. I don't think a lot of that is what we would call organic. I think a lot of that is being introduced, with the Ferguson riots. And I'm not here to do conspiracy theories, but I will state the fact is that in Ferguson there is a certain number of people that are living there that registered to vote. These people live in Ferguson, Missouri. When these Ferguson riots happened, something like 2 or 3 times the amount of people were there.
In Charlotte, actually, I think 70% of the people that they arrested were actually from out of state.
Yeah.
So they were being bussed in. So I think it very much is I think it's very possible that it is a conspiracy. I mean, I don't want to be that guy that's, the fluoride in the water is making the frogs gay. But, when the United States government comes out and says, yes, very much, we are doing chemtrails, nothing else seems very far off. So,
now the real problem is, groups like Black Lives Matter have this... It's funny. Vladimir Lenin once said that communism is impossible without big banks. No revolutionary social movement. Let's be real. That's what Black Lives Matter is. I mean, if you read their manifesto, they are functionally communists.
Yeah.
They need backers. They need powerful capitalist backers.
Yeah.
And Black Lives Matter has found this in the form of George Soros.
Yeah.
Who funds all kinds of shit.
Right.
He's got his fingers in every Marxist pie you can think of.
Yeah. Well, and I think was it Joseph Lenin that actually said that the socialists are actually just the useful. He called them the useful idiots necessary to usher in communism.
Yeah, I mean, really, socialism and communism both have their roots in the same kind of venomous seed. It's this idea of collective ownership, which really just means state ownership.
Right.
And it's interesting.
Yeah.
I'm actually going to take a page out of the anarcho-primitives handbook a little bit here. Sans blowing up federal buildings, but
Hey, Kaczynski did nothing wrong.
oh my god, no, he absolutely did. Yeah, it was very wrong. The idea here, like you're talking about the ethno-nationalist states and stuff. I don't think it necessarily has to get to that. I really don't. Because I just don't see it working on a realistic level. Like we can philosophize about this all night long, and it would, and it sounds wonderful.
It may look good on paper, but in practice,
I don't think it would work.
The thing is it has worked in practice. It was like that from the dawn of mankind all the way up until really the French Revolution.
What I'm getting at, and we're heading towards the same direction. Just give me a second. It doesn't need to be a giant movement to, it doesn't have to be a national movement. Like all the Latinos in the United States don't have to go to one spot. It doesn't require that. That isn't what's necessary. What's necessary, and this is where I'm talking about the premise, and I've said this before, you need tribes. What you get, if you get a group of people, a group of 300 people max, usually because 300 is about as big as you can keep contact with people and really know. But you get groups of 300 people, say, and they all believe the same thing. Whether that be religious, secular, or whatever have you, whether it be economic or whatever. Yeah. But they go, and they create their own little community. Whether that be in the form of a tribe, which is what I tend to be more partial to, because as I tend to fly under the heathen flag, so I tend to like the ideas of clans and tribes, and I like that kind of stuff. And I'm also a turbo nerd, so that stuff also like Lord of the Rings kind of ideology, and like I like the artwork and the tapestry and that kind of, so that kind of stuff appeals to me. So I love the idea of like starting a clan and that kind of framework. So, but you don't need everybody to do. You need clans and tribes, and when it comes down to that, it doesn't matter what color you are. It doesn't matter what you believe, because ideally, at the end of the day, the clan is looking out for its own. The tribe is looking out for its own. So if you get a group of people, very large groups of people together to create their own tribes. And as long as they're doing what's right by the federal government, I'm not saying that you should this is not a takeover the government, like this is not any of that. I'm talking about people creating communities that they're in, that they're part of, that they know people by, that they get in there and they start doing their own thing. Now, whatever lines these groups decide to draw is entirely up to them, whether they want it to be ethnic or whether they want it to be religious or whether they want it to be what have you, but. It doesn't matter who you are or what your skin color is when you're in a group of 300 people, because everybody just wants to eat.
Well, I think part of the... that's a great and romantic idea, but I think part of the issue with that is that if we make essentially enclaves or city-states under a larger civic nationalist structure... Mm-hmm. It still can't represent everybody. From my background in the hood, it was a tight-knit community. Everyone there knew each other, and that did not stop them from killing each other.
Well,
and if they wanted to live in a country where things like, honor dueling, where violence was acceptable under certain conditions... If they wanted to live in a community like that, that is by all means their prerogative.
Right.
But if that behavior is... If those values are not reciprocated by the government under which they live, they will always be in conflict with said government.
Well, and the biggest issue really is that it is in the best interest of a large government to homogenize the people under it.
Yeah, of course.
It makes them easier to control.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You can't... When the purpose of a large government is to look out for everyone...
It can't look out for everyone unless they're all the same.
Well, that old maxim, if everyone is my brother, then I have no brothers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and it's funny because our government has a vested interest in homogenizing us because it makes us easier to track, makes us easier to look at and really study
numbers on a spreadsheet as opposed to
it's easier to look at a spreadsheet and hard numbers than it is to track real live living breathing people. Mm-hmm. Another big problem is that we have this kind of we have a relatively laissez-faire capitalist economic system, And that's given rise to a lot of large corporations that are very closely tied with governmental interests. Mm-hmm. Every major industry has a lobby in Washington. Yeah. And it's in their best interest to homogenize us. Mm-hmm. Because if we're all the same, if our communities are all this kind of, beige, semi-secular, culturalist mass, then we can all be sold the same shit.
Mm-hmm. Well, that may be what they want, but that's largely in our control. That is in our hands, not theirs. What they want doesn't mean a hill of beans if we won't give it to them.
And that's where we start getting into the question of, do we really control it? We see companies all the time doing shady shit without us even knowing. We can't control things if we don't know what's going on.
We don't even control our own food supply anymore. Cough, cough, Monsanto.
Well, on top of that, we have issues like, I would love to drink raw and pasteurized milk. Humans have been drinking it for more than 10,000 years and it's not killed us yet.
Oh yeah, but if you sell it, you can go to jail.
The FDA will have a SWAT team at your house killing your livestock, and they will imprison the family breadwinner. They will destroy families over milk. Mm-hmm. And that's really where the problem is. I love Jack Rabbit's idea of culture, of communities with a shared fate, to borrow the language of Jack Donovan once again. Great guy, read his stuff. Yep. But that's, as great an idea as it is, it's becoming increasingly difficult under the system we currently have. I love the idea, and I want that for us as the people in general. But we need to alter. We need to alter the larger governmental superstructure first.
Well, I think there's precedent for this that I think is potentially workable if it's enacted by people who have an inkling towards government and structure. The natives of this continent, they have their different tiers of organization where you have, say, the Cherokee Nation, which is then further divided into bands, and then tribes.
Yeah, you have the Southern Band and the Eastern Band and the Western Band, and then you also have like the Sioux and the
Yeah, I think that larger countries like America could be broken up into smaller nations. We could have a Germanic American nation, and then within the context of the Germanic American nation, we could have tribes like Jackrabbit wants, that are backed up by a nation that shares the same or very similar values to the tribes it's over.
Right.
If we have the West African Mandenka tribe and the Germanic American tribe living in the same state, the state that rules over both tribes is going to have to try to balance the issues of both.
I'll tell you where I'm coming from here a little bit. I'm a little, and perhaps I'm a little uncomfortable when you start talking about race as something to segregate even willingly, because the problem I run into is when you run into stuff like that, even if it's a self-segregation thing or a balkanization, which is really what you're talking about.
Yeah.
It makes me a little uncomfortable because I've always, when you start separating people, it's one step away.
There's the danger of ethnic cleansing.
There's that danger of ethnic cleansing, and I have friends. Again, I was in the military, and then I went and worked in the private sector for a long time. I have friends of every color, faith, and creed.
Yeah.
And I don't want any of them to have a shitty time. I want everybody to be happy. I mean, you can't obviously you can't have everybody happy, but the trick is it's that one step away from the ethnic cleansing, and and there's also that idea of, well, quite frankly, hurt feelings. That whole you don't belong with us because you happen to be half this or half that. That's a kind of a fucked up thing to do to a person.
Run this by you. Just take everything. Just kind of take the system we already have and simplify it. And what I mean by this is, it used to be that running for office and it was a civic duty. If you saw something wrong in your community, you ran for office, you did something to change it. You got enough people to vote for you. I think that has been lost. Because here's the thing. I know my community better than some guy from out of state does, or some guy, and I guess what I'm getting at here is it's a tragedy that political office has been sought as a position of power, and we've been taught that you should go for it if you want power and money, as opposed to if you want to be a civic servant who's trying to make a difference. That is what people are craving. That is why Donald Trump made it into the office, because he came across as a civic servant wanting to make a difference. He didn't come across as, I'm a sleazy dirtbag trying to get some power,
Whether the truth of that being
right.
Here's the thing, I don't dislike Trump, but I also I'm not a giant Trump.
Oh yeah, you shouldn't be a bootlicker by any means.
Right, that's what I'm getting at. I see a lot of people on the right that do that. They're like, Trump, and I'm like,
everybody was anti-Trump, then he got in office, and now all of a sudden,
and
I agree. It's good to be skeptical, especially when you're talking about, how many times we've been lied to and bamboozled. We've been bamboozled.
Did us some hand
Once again, though, if you come at it, and if somebody claims to be a servant and then they don't deliver, well, you don't vote him in next time. You don't be stupid. But you get bit the first time, you don't get bit again. But people need to look at running for local office as a duty, not as as a civic duty and as a civic servant, not as a position of power.
Mm-hmm.
And I really like Coffee Pot's idea, looking at it as a responsibility. I think part of the reason people don't, though, is we live just outside a pretty metropolitan city, City X, and City X is very diverse. And it's very hard for me to give a crap about City X.
Right. Because
there are my people within City X, but City X is not my people. Now, Jackrabbit is concerned about, the idea of balkanization.
And rightly so.
Balkanization could be really ugly. But we don't have to go whole hog with it. I think there's kind of a soft middle ground, where America could stay America, but I think we should take a second look at the Confederation model.
Mm-hmm.
Let states determine. Give states much more self-determination as far as their own issues and laws go.
Right, well, a state knows what's better for it then.
Yeah, and based on their own populations, Alabama has a very high Black American population. If they start pushing through their own laws that benefit Black Americans will naturally want to move there.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to force anyone to go anywhere. If we give populations the ability to determine their own values for themselves, they will attract their own kind.
Yeah, people have a tendency to naturally and organically gravitate toward people who agree with them, people who share their values and culture, and places where those people live. If the
federal government would just pull some of its fingers out of the pie, we could have a sort of soft de facto balkanization without much or any bloodshed.
Yeah, we could just let humans' natural tendency to congregate organically just do its thing. The problem is right now we have, for example, you'll see, and I'm probably gonna sound a little strange talking like this, but how often do you see a Black community called, say, or let me rephrase that. How often do you see people criticize an all-Black community for not being diverse enough? Almost never.
Mm-hmm.
How often do you see a white community criticized for not being diverse enough?
All the time.
Because we have this almost state-enforced multiculturalism, where we're not allowed, and it's especially bad if you're white. Yeah. You're not allowed to congregate with your own people. We have, for some reason, we have this idea that if you don't have a multicultural community, then the people in that community are somehow racist or xenophobic or something.
Yeah.
It's not that. It's just
no. I just think Coffee Pot is pretty.
Doesn't don't touch me.
But we humans have a natural tendency to move toward people who act like them and who look like them. It's actually interesting. There was a study done on empathy, actually, and how race affects your ability to empathize with other people. When one human looks at another human and you start doing things, like you perform an action, like you scratch your chin or, smooth your hair or something, the motor cortex of your brain will fire in response to that person's movement. Because you see it and your brain goes, oh, I should do that. Mm-hmm. But it's actually been shown that people of any given race are much less likely to do that in response to seeing someone of a different race do it. Because we're hardwired to, on a base level, prefer our own. Yeah. It's not racism. It's actually why we still exist. There's a certain amount of biological group preference in humans because it's good for our survival to a certain degree.
Well, I mean, we're looking at it from an evolutionary standpoint. We're pack hunters. Like, a really good analog for primitive human is wolf packs. And two wolf packs in the same hunting range will fight until one wolf pack leaves or dies.
Mm-hmm. Or is subsumed. That does you very occasionally see the merging of packs.
Yeah,
but that second when you do pack is always subservient.
Yeah, when you do see the merging of packs, the wolves from the defeated pack are always, the delta, gamma males.
Yeah.
In the new combined pack.
Yeah.
Hierarchy is just, it's natural to people. And I think the only way to fairly break down a multicultural hierarchy is to give people more natural, homogeneous hierarchy.
So not necessarily cause any of this to happen.
But just
allow it to happen.
Yeah. And ideally, that's what I would want. The problem is right now in the model we're currently following,
we're not allowed to even discuss it.
And all it does
is very, very subversive.
You guys are so racist.
But right now, the model we've got, all it's doing is creating friction.
Right.
We've got cultural and to a certain degree racial friction between the different groups because we're all forced to deal with each other all the time. Mm-hmm. If we were just allowed to move organically and create our own communities organically without outside interference, a lot of this would go away. But because we're trying to enforce a certain degree of diversity and multiculturalism, you look at the U.S. right now, and every time a cop shoots somebody, we teeter on the brink of race war over it, and it's insane.
Okay, so what are they doing specifically to keep us from doing this?
Run this in there. Is it more so because it doesn't appear natural to me to, when a criminal gets shot, to all of a sudden, okay, let's write and stuff. Once again, and I go back to this, I think it has more to do with training and with what you've been taught from little on up than it has to do with a natural bias per se.
Yeah, a large portion of it is cultural, and that's another one of our problems. Is we have many disparate cultures that are forced to live together. Well, we're two people who hate each other, forced to share a lease.
So I see a lot of people, or I hear you guys talking about. So let's talk about that a little bit. So what's happening that's forcing? Because the last time I checked, nobody checked my race when I moved into my apartment. They didn't check to make sure that I was white enough or black enough or there was enough culture. So you know what I'm saying? There's no one's forcing you to move in.
It's very subtle.
That's the thing. They're literally not allowed to. This building is by federal law
equal opportunity.
It is. Okay. It is essentially multicultural.
If
you wanted to have a building that was a community of like individuals, you can't do that in America.
For that.
Okay, well, that being said, though, there's also nothing saying that it... What you're saying is... You were saying before that people will naturally do this given their own free will and volition. However, because of this whole freedom of non-discrimination, it would seem like you would see more of people just flocking together in their living areas and stuff like that. And to a certain degree, you do. But again, I don't see the forced multiculturalism in, like, say, a living condition, specifically living conditions, because it's just not.
Well, a lot of it's in academia. You look at colleges. Colleges, nearly every major college has racial quotas.
So I'm taking away that, because colleges and also workforces are a different animal, because those definitely are forced to a certain degree, because
those, however, are the main vehicle of socialization. In a modern country. That is. Schooling is your primary form of socialization for much of your life.
It's where your culture comes from.
Yeah, that is,
and culture informs your behavior.
They start in your formative years, telling you this is how you should think, this is how you should behave, this is how people should relate to each other, and you're never given a choice to really make up your own mind. And that's all by federal mandate. That's all by federal and state mandate. The state tells you have to be taught like this. And if you want anything different, you have to go to a private school, and even then, I mean, there are certain federal and state guidelines they have to abide by. Well, once you get out of school, your primary mode of socialization from then on is the workforce.
Or college,
but that's more of schooling. So it's actually kind of unfair to discount schooling and the workforce, because those are how in the modern liberal democracy, that is how the majority of your social attitudes are formed.
Not only that, but you're talking about why people congregate the way they do. Could it not also be an economic thing, do you think? Because people go where jobs are. Right now the Sun Belt is becoming. I mean, it's the next boomtown per se. When you get along like California, Texas, these areas, that's where your work is. So naturally, your people that your tradesmen go down there to welders go down there to get jobs welding down there, and then
they got to eat and they got to stay somewhere.
Right, they got to stay somewhere. So then you've got the Indians that go down and start gas stations or something.
And a large part of it is economic. Like it's,
I would hesitate to say that it's mostly economic. I would, matter of fact, I think a good 70% of it is economic, because economics are very important when it comes down to certain
to a certain degree, I do believe that's true. I think Cobra has something to say.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've actually seen this exactly. Economics is a huge factor in how people gather, because in the 50s we had an event, a kind of vague, nebulous event known as the Great White Migration, where white people moved out of inner cities into suburbs, and cities became heavily concentrated with minorities. And at the time, whites owned large portions of industry and business. And so without those job-creating forces in the big cities, a lot of people's economic situations, a lot of minority people's economic situations in the big cities declined rapidly. Well, consequently, the cities becoming poor and crime-ridden, the minorities then began to flee from the cities and made the suburbs what the cities were before the whites migrated out. Leaving only the worst in the big cities. And now, because there's so much vacant space in the big cities, the exact opposite of the 50s has begun happening, where affluent whites are moving back into the cities and gentrifying it, and making it cool again.
And that's where it becomes a racial issue again. Because you look at whites moving back into the areas that they had previously lived in and then left.
And now the minorities who live there are, again, in tension because, these are our places, we never left.
Yeah.
Well, and by that logic, though, it seems like it would just be a cycle that would repeat itself in a way. And
history is all cycles.
Oh, I know that, but in my mind, it's like, if it's nothing but a cycle, should we even worry about it?
Well, I mean,
cycles and patterns can be altered. There are variables that play into how patterns form. Mm-hmm. And when you introduce new variables or alter the variables, the pattern changes. And I think there are things that could be done. What they are, I'm not going to claim to be an economist or a culture expert, but there are ways in which we could change the pattern, that we could change the variables in play to produce a more favorable pattern, I think, for everyone.
I'll be honest. I think the problem is, I'm going to Occam's razor this a little bit. I think the solution of the problem is way simpler than what we're discussing. I think it would actually just be, I think it would be simpler just if everybody was allowed to be proud of who and what they are.
Yeah.
You know, if you were able to come up with somebody and say, "Hey, tell me about your cool ancestors and your cool like traditions and stuff," and I want to know.
Yeah.
And then then you tell people about your cool ancestors, your cool traditions.
Yeah.
I think it would solve a lot more problems than.
This really is, I think, the root of the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Playing devil's advocate here. Sorry for cutting you off. Chadis.
My own fucking brother.
Hey,
Sorry.
it isn't his fault you chose the hardest name in humanity.
Sorry for cutting you off, but to play devil's advocate here, you know, Jack Rabbit, our fine Nordic individual, comes up to me, Tyrone, our Black American, and says, "Tell me about your cool culture." Tell me about your cool culture. I, Tyrone, having been told my whole life that I'm subservient to Jack Rabbit, responds quite bitterly, "Well, I don't know. Whitey destroyed all African history. We don't have any artifacts left." That is a great dialogue we just had, Jack Rabbit.
Well, and the funny thing is, you know...
Well, no, I'm not... No, I'm going to disagree with that 100% because you have movements that are happening within the Black community that I've been watching. One of the friends of mine that I deployed with, I don't get into that dialogue, that community, because, well, it's not my place. It's not my place to get into that dialogue, but it's interesting to watch. And I've been watching a resurgence of specifically Black Americans. They are really touching back into their African roots. And I'm not talking about the outliers like the Black Panther Party and stuff.
Yeah.
I'm talking about your average everyday, I work in a factory, mainstream,
Yeah.
Black
But I mean,
Americans. And they've been reclaiming that culture, and they've been studying it. There's an interest growing there. And I'm happy about that. I'm excited about that.
Because
that excites me. Because
the more they connect with their culture from the past, that's less of the problem culture that we see so much of now.
Right.
You know.
Yeah.
and I absolutely agree with that.
So
but
in that scenario, that individual that I'd be talking to, give it some years. You might be surprised.
Yeah.
You might have.
But at the state of things right now, that's likely how that dialogue would go as of this moment.
well, that and Tyrone sort of has a point. I mean, you look at Rhodesia, where the state mandated dialogue was that everything great of historic importance in sub-Saharan Africa was performed by now extinct whites from northern Africa. The state mandated narrative in Rhodesia, which no longer exists, but
Well, it doesn't exist anymore. There's a reason.
yeah, but Zimbabwe that now exists, where Rhodesia used to, they don't have any history from before like the 60s.
Yeah.
Because Rhodesia literally destroyed it all.
And that's actually
any artifacts from pre-Rhodesia Zimbabwe that contradicted the Rhodesian narrative were blown up.
Yeah, that's actually a problem.
So Tyrone actually has a point.
Yeah, this is actually a problem we see with a lot of the history of colonization in sub-Saharan Africa. The European powers, the kind of de facto people group they attributed everything to was the Phoenicians. Because during that period of colonialism, it was assumed that the Phoenicians were white. They were, in fact, some sort of Semitic group. But they had everything attributed to them because the European mind at that time could not conceive of what were essentially Stone Age people when Europeans arrived. I mean, I don't mean to denigrate them, but that's how they were viewed at the time.
Doesn't mean that they were any less smart.
It was different. They were different. It was a different culture. It was a different society. But it was the prevailing view at the time during the 17 and 1800s was that there was no way that these Stone Age people could have built these great things. And so that shaped the archaeological and historical narrative really up through into the 20th century. So a lot of the culture and history and tradition of these African people has just been destroyed. There's not much left of it.
And so a lot of the more friendly side of Black nationalist identity, where they're trying to regain their history, a lot of that, very similar to, Norse pagan identity, is having to be reconstructed from conjecture a lot of the time.
Yeah. And it's really interesting because you hear something I wish I could tell Black people is in the history of slavery, especially the transatlantic slave trade. A lot of that slave stock was coming from a very specific social class. In Africa at the time, the model of warfare was that two armies would meet together, their champions would fight, and if they couldn't come to a consensus on who won, the armies would fight, and whoever lost was taken as property by the winning side. And that's where a lot of that slave stock came from.
Yeah.
These were these people's warriors. These were the best these were the best of the best. Okay, so we have in modern Black urban culture, we see a lot of, and you'll notice there's a lot of machismo about it. It's it's all it's the toughest guys. It's the kind of gangster rap mindset, and it's not all that far off from the truth, the cultural truth. A lot of these people are descended from actual warriors. They come from warrior cultures with long, proud histories, but they don't know that. They don't know where they came from. They've had their roots cut off. And I think it's wonderful that a lot of that people are trying to really dig back into that. Because I think if the Black community really took a look at their origins as a people here in the U.S., I think they would have I think they'd be able to kind of step above the oppression narrative and really embrace who they are as a proud people who is essentially just kind of I'm kind of they were essentially cheated out of their history because they were brought over here and they weren't told anything because we didn't know, we didn't care. And when I say we, I mean the people involved in the trade. Obviously not us.
There's no such thing as white guilt. I didn't enslave your grandfather.
I enslaved no one. My family fought on the Union side in the Civil War, and my grandmother was a sharecropper.
Our grandmother was a slave.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. You told me about that.
She was an indentured servant and actually lived
in the former slave quarters
with the blacks that were working the sharecrop farm.
Yeah. So that's really and Jackrabbit has a point. Like, and I think it's a very good point that bears repeating. Everybody every group needs to really rediscover who they are and be proud of who they are. Like mine and Cobra's family were almost entirely Scandinavian with some Anglo-Saxon tossed in for flavor and a little bit of Italian. I'm proud as hell of that. I know where my ancestors came from, and I can look and I can see the long history they built and passed down. And that gives me roots that I can grow from. And I think everybody deserves those roots.
Yeah.
Well, not only that, I also think, going back to, you were talking about, white guilt not existing. I don't think the son can be blamed for the sins of the father, nor vice versa, because it's a case where when you're looking at that, okay, dad might have been a bank robber, but does that mean that I should be punished for his crimes? No, I have no control over what dad or what granddad did. Yeah. And, I think that's another issue that, I guess it's almost a, trying to think of the term here, almost like a, not a bloodlust, but a, will make you pay for,
It's a desire for revenge.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I don't think that as a culture, I think we need to lay that aside.
We need to step away from that revenge thing.
Right.
But on the flip side of that, I don't believe there's no such thing as racial guilt.
Mm-hmm.
But I do believe to a certain extent in responsibility
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I mean, well, look back at history, and it did happen.
But I mean, a lot of ethno-nationalists, myself not included, believe in the repatriation of Black Americans back to Africa. That does not make a single lick of sense to me because they have never been to Africa. They do not know Africa. Africans are not their people anymore. Oh, yeah. Their people are Black Americans. I think they should have a place here within the structure and framework that they're already familiar with in which to thrive.
I'm actually split on the issue of repatriation. I think if people want to go back,
they should certainly have the option.
They should most definitely have the option.
Yeah, the problem is will those former countries reaccept them?
And that is an issue.
And I mean, Dave Chappelle tried that, and quoth him, "Those are not our people
that's
anymore."
That's actually why the country of Liberia exists. We as the United States actually purchased that land, and founded a country there for repatriation, and nobody went.
Because Africa's terrible. Who would want to live there?
Well, that portion of it is anyway. Like the entire continent is actually kind of nice, but
but we bought the worst of the worst.
Yeah.
There.
Oh my
goodness. Conceptually, I like the idea of repatriation, but I also know it's unworkable and unfair.
Well, that and I mean, like, if somebody makes, the idea of repatriation necessary to be a true ethno-nationalist, then all of us white people have to leave America too. This isn't our land.
We did fight for it.
Well, again, same argument for literally every other group of people here.
Yeah. But
I'm pretty sure Germany is not ready to handle this.
No.
Yeah.
No. A lot of the political discourse we get to have here in the United States is actually very illegal in Germany.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's bad.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. My ancestors may be Swedish, but I'm kind of glad that I'm not because I couldn't say this in Sweden.
Yeah, no.
Oh, well, that's like, there's a really popular YouTuber called The Golden One. I actually follow his YouTube videos. He actually made a video, not this most recent one, but the one before that. He actually addressed the Swedish police because apparently he's on their radar.
Because he's right wing.
Because he committed the terrible crime of being conservative.
He actually brings it up. From time to time that he has to be careful what he says, because he has to travel for work, and if he says certain things, he can't, for instance, go to Germany.
Mm-hmm.
They'll bar him from entering the country.
Wow.
And politics in Sweden is interesting because he actually mentions that there is no right wing in Sweden. You have an extreme left and then a center left.
Yeah.
And those are your options.
Yeah.
The party their most nationalistic party is center left.
Yep. And that's just that's interesting. But yeah, so we've done a lot of talking tonight. Didn't really get terribly far, but I think we fleshed out some ideas.
Yeah.
It's a complex issue, and we'll probably never reach a conclusion to this debate.
Right.
It's
the trick is how do you make really the issue is how do you treat everyone equally and fairly and still have groups. Basically, peace and cohesion. It's a fairly difficult concept to really wrap your head around, especially when you have
essentially what we're talking about here is how do we achieve world peace?
And really, I think the easiest, simplest way to do this is to go back to the original founding idea. While personally, I would like separate ethno-states that are self-ruling countries. I think a good compromise, and I mentioned this at the beginning, is there a middle ground between civic and ethnic nationalism? And I think a good compromise would be to go back to the founding idea of the United States.
Well, every state knows best
how to rule its own people.
Yeah, how to rule its own people. Case in point, you're talking about
California gun laws do not work in
North Carolina.
No.
In the same, and I would even dare say from city to city, the gun laws of, let's say Charlotte may not work for,
really
somewhere else,
Give the people the ability to choose for themselves how they're ruled at the most local possible level.
Yeah. And that's, when you look back, I think before the Civil War, before people started really beginning to move around from state to state, you were more patriotic to your state than
yeah.
you were to your nation.
It's interesting. Robert E. Lee, him and Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant, both West Point graduates.
Yeah, good friends too.
Yeah, fought on opposing sides in the war because Robert E. Lee could not abandon Virginia.
Yeah, the Union Army actually approached him.
Yeah, Robert E. Lee didn't want to fight in the Civil War at all, but when Virginia seceded, he followed his state rather than stay loyal to his country.
Yeah, and I think that that mindset, that kind of localist mindset, would do us very well in the modern era.
I can agree with that. I think that if you had, yeah, I think that would be so.
And I mean, even on the left, we're saying like, you know, even these sort of Green Party hippie types, you know, they don't want guns. They're multicultural, but they're still urging us buy local, buy organic, buy your next door neighbor's spare tomatoes.
This might actually possibly be a compromise where the left would actually agree with us, because if we have groups where
the
left,
localist,
if the left can do what they want to in their own area, then perhaps this would be something we could actually compromise on.
Yeah,
Speaking of, did you get a chance to get a hold of the
Jewish Antifa? No, I did not. But I will try again.
Okay. Oh, did you try once before?
Yeah, I tend to be ignored. Maybe my crossed Faskies profile picture doesn't help.
That probably doesn't help. I might change that and try again.
My kill traitors before enemies cover picture.
That's you making friends everywhere you go.
Well, once they get to know me.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, he's just as bad as we thought.
I mean, potato potato.
But maybe try again, because I would enjoy getting them on. Trying to get a discourse going on with them, that would be interesting, I think, and helpful. In the meantime, I think we're kind of went over it a little bit, but that's okay. Anybody else have anything to say before we wrap it up?
buy local.
Yeah.
Yeah, buy local. Alrighty.
Buy local unpasteurized milk. The FDA will hate it.
Also, don't steal. The government hates competition.
Right.
We didn't say that. Also, taxation is theft.
Yep.
Lol, what are roads?
Lol, what are roads?
We're going
Alrighty, folks. Alright, folks. This has been another episode of RightCast, because the left one's broken. I'm your host. They call me the Jackrabbit. With me is
Shadus
and
Coffee pot.
and
Cobra.
alrighty, guys. You have a wonderful night. See you next week.